Every year, we look at what's kind of going on in the mind space of internal communications professionals and where they're putting their focus and their resources. Now that the first few months of 2026 are in the rear view, we can take a look at what new trends and tech are emerging, at least for now, because in today's fast-paced environment, what's cutting edge in April might be standard practice or even completely irrelevant by June. To talk to me today about all this is Debbie DeWitt, Marketing Communications Manager for Visix. Hi, Debbie. Welcome back to Digital Signage Done Right.
Thanks, Derek. I always look forward to our Trends episode every year.
Yeah, it actually gets a lot of listens. And speaking of listens, thank you everybody out there for listening. I remind you can subscribe and review, and you can follow along with a transcript on the Visix website. Whether you're using digital signage or not, our podcast gives you practical tips for communications and content to better engage your audience. I'm Derek DeWitt. Welcome to Digital Signage Done Right. So, Debbie, before we look at 2026's unique trends, should communicators be doing some kind of reflection on how the last year went?
Absolutely. I mean, even though the trends are evolving rapidly, like you said, the fundamentals of good planning haven't really changed. You need to take a look at last year's audience engagement data and identify where the gaps are. You want to review which channels actually move the needle versus which ones just, quite frankly, created noise. And this year especially, you need to look at whether you contributed to change fatigue or helped people navigate it.
Yes, change fatigue. A term I like, and I understand it's actually becoming kind of a massive issue.
Yeah.
For the first time, change fatigue shot to number 2 on the list of biggest challenges in the annual survey that Gallagher does. Since 2020, 85% of executives report an increase in change initiatives, with over half seeing more than a 25% increase compared to pre-pandemic levels. That's a lot of change in kind of a short period of time.
It really is. And here's the big problem. The global workforce can only cope with about 50% of the changes being thrown at them, according to Gartner research.
I mean, that's a huge gap.
It is. And according to Gallup, resistance rarely comes from change itself, which I think is very important because it comes from constantly shifting priorities with poor explanation. This is where it ties back into our communications. So, as you review last year, you need to ask, were we clear about those priorities? Did we help people understand them and how to participate in the success?
Did we even articulate them to ourselves?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's an important way to frame it. So where are you getting your 2026 predictions from?
Well, a bunch of articles and research. We've already mentioned some. We've got Gallagher, we've got Gartner, we've got Gallup, we've got all the G's. It's like 10 or 12 sources.
So how different are trends for 2026 from what we've talked about in previous years?
It's odd, but this year kind of feels like an inflection point. Some familiar themes are still there, but they're maturing in unexpected ways. And more importantly, there are some new challenges emerging that we haven't really grappled with before. The idea of internal, quote, internal communications as a protected space is basically dead. Change is now continuous and layered. It's not a bunch of discrete projects. And there's an identity crisis happening where communicators are realizing they can't just be a message distributor. Like with everything else, I will say also, AI is a huge disruptor.
Yes, that's true. And I know that possibly sounds overly dramatic, but I know what you mean when it comes to AI. A lot of people are kind of freaking out about it. Some people think AI makes everyone a good enough writer because the standards are kind of low. And this has been putting a lot of pressure on internal communications employees to prove that they do more than just copywriting. If the AI can do good enough for the boss, what do they need me for? And the fact is that communicators do a lot more. Internal communicators align employees with business goals, they foster engagement, and they drive culture. I mean, it's a lot more than just blasting out text.
Also, you need to know employees are using like AI summaries instead of reading full messages, which means a lot of carefully crafted content is actually being skimmed or sliced and chopped. So internal communicators are being squeezed from both sides. The teams that get labeled as simply content producers are going to soon look just like overhead that can be cut. So internal comms has gotten this figurative, seat at the table the past few years. Now they have to keep it and show their true value.
Okay. All right. So that's kind of the overall thing. Let's get into some specific trends. What's the first major one for 2026?
We've touched on it a little bit, but the first trend is navigating continuous and layered change, moving from announcement to orientation. And that's not like bringing new people on, that's orientating people within all of this change. According to Interscope's research, in 2026, change will not arrive, land, and then stabilize. It's going to be layered. This fundamentally alters the role of internal communications.
Layered means that you're not getting like one change initiative and then that finishes and then a new one starts. What you're getting is sort of organizational restructuring happening while you're rolling out new AI tools or implementing new hybrid policies or dealing with market shifts. It's all happening at the same time and they overlap.
Right. I mean, the job's no longer to announce your milestones. It's to help people orient themselves continuously within all of this change. And it's about helping employees understand what matters right now, what can wait, and how today's message connects to yesterday's message. That's why change fatigue is such a big issue.
Back to that Gallup research that showed that resistance doesn't come from change itself, but it comes from poor explanations of the change. I like that because I think the knee-jerk, quote-unquote, common sense is, well, people just don't like change. But that's not necessarily true.
No, I mean, the question communicators need to ask is, are your internal communications built for events or for environments? An event would be discrete. An environment is ongoing. So if you're still treating each change as a separate announcement, I hate to say it, but you're part of the problem. We always tell people who might not be trained in communications, this is a process, not a project.
Right. And this layered change obviously connects to the feeling of information overload.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everything we talk about today is tied to information overload. Employees are drowning in information.
So how do communicators respond to that? I think this is where the concept of cognitive respect comes in. We've talked about this a bit in the past. Acknowledging people's perspectives and their cognitive loads.
Yeah. And I think you do that by getting intentional. The teams that will thrive are the ones that focus on clear purpose, outcomes, and action, rather than just pushing out endless content. You need to prioritize quality over quantity. We've always said this. Yeah. There was a stat that about 43% of communicators say solving information overload through personalization is a key priority. That means delivering content that's only relevant to that specific audience or those specific individuals. And you need to make sure that information enables those employees to turn it into action. This shotgun approach of let's put out everything to everyone just needs to go away.
Yeah, I think it's kind of old, late 19th, early 20th century advertising ideas that have permeated the communication space. And information and the way that we consume information has changed. And so we have to change the way that we parse it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that advertising thing also, you need to make clear that's external communications. Internal should have always been more focused, but
it wasn't.
No, and there are still going to be things like overall mission of the company and some branding things that are going to be relevant for all audiences. But this is really about, when we're talking especially about change management, you need to be targeted.
Yeah. So this combination of layered change and information overload, or the feeling of it, sort of creates this perfect storm. And this is why communicators need to create clear roadmaps that show how different initiatives relate to each other, to the overall thrust of the company, the overall direction. You need to use consistent frameworks so that people can categorize the information, which then helps them kind of take bites and digest it properly.
Yeah, if your team doesn't understand how all of these different things layer and interact with each other, how can you expect, employees to navigate it? And I would say you have to prioritize ruthlessly. Not everything is urgent. And you need to build in regular what matters now touch points rather than just announcing what's new. Some organizations are even implementing change governance, which is reviewing all of the proposed changes to kind of assess the timing and the impact before adding another thing to employees' plates.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. We have a lot more about this sort of thing in our episode about combating digital overload. There's a link in the transcript, so check that out, people listening. So that's the first one. The second trend is, it's all over the place, expanding AI use beyond just content creation to become a strategic partner. And part of this depends also on what AI system you're using. So not all AIs are equal. We use the term AI, but they're not all the same thing, and they're not all good for the same sorts of tasks. And this is a major evolution, really, from just a year ago. Don't you think AI usage has evolved so rapidly that it's almost impossible to keep up with it?
That's true. And I think educating ourselves about how to use the AI is a big hurdle, really. Like you said, I think a lot of people still are using it just to write copy and things. I mean, according to a Reagan and Polite Mail, I think it was the company, there was a survey, only 22 respondents said they aren't using AI at work in 2026. So the majority are using it, but most are still using it pretty narrowly. Right now, 75% use it for drafting or editing content, 47% for taking meeting notes or transcribing interviews, and 25% for analyzing employee sentiment. That's the big one, analyzing.
Yeah. This stuff has moved far beyond its initial sort of experimental phase. But I think the opportunity is much bigger. I think the real value comes from using AI strategically, like you said, to analyze engagement data, uncover patterns that maybe would take me a long, long time, but the AI can do it very quickly. Oh, I see this pattern. You can identify which messages resonate with which employee groups, or allowing you to segment audiences intelligently and optimize send times, flag gaps in communication coverage, and just become better at your job.
And maybe even predict information overload before it happens. We've talked about analytics for years. Everybody's comfortable with analytics. I think they need to bridge that in their minds of analytics and AI and figure out how the two work together. By automating analysis and decision support, AI could let communicators focus on strategy, relationship building, and advising, the C-suite. It needs to become an analytical and strategic partner, not just a writing assistant.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think the big scare story out there is it's coming for your job. But I think the strategic use of AI is really about freeing up humans for higher value work. You are a human. You can do much more interesting stuff. And we need that more interesting stuff to be done as well. Now you have the time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Higher value work is the key there, and it's also about addressing that existential question you've been talking about. When AI can write messages, what's left for internal communications professionals? And the answer is strategic thinking. The meaning making, the relationship building, all of those things you said before, keeping the mission on track, keeping those high level objectives moving forward and navigating all those changes.
AI handles the tactical execution so that we can focus on things that really only humans can do well. I think this ties in well with the third trend, which is the communicator identity shift. We're changing from being content producers to meaning makers. And I think this is a very existential trend.
Yes, communications can be thought of as a simple function. You have a message and we deliver it.
Yeah.
When anyone can generate decent content in seconds, being a content producer isn't seen as a valuable skill anymore. So it's essential that communicators clearly define their identity and their role as it connects to business goals. Like I said, it's about positioning yourself as someone who drives business outcomes. Don't just send emails.
Like you said before, it's more than just about content. It's about strategic thinking, the meaning making, the relationship building.
Yeah, they help people make sense of information rather than just sharing it. I think that's a big one right there. Help them make sense of it. Don't just share it. They connect the dots between different initiatives. They translate complexity into clarity. And they need to identify what's truly important versus what's just noise. Internal communications was never just the messaging from the IC team. I will say it's all the different conversations happening inside the company. The question is, are you shaping those conversations or are you just adding noise to them?
That's very powerful. The fourth trend is micro-communities and employee-led networks, replacing the kind of one-size-fits-all channels that have been the standard and the norm for so long. Gallagher's report shows that traditional organization-wide channels are losing traction. In 2026, we're going to see smaller interest or location-based networks to drive deeper connection and advocacy. That's what they say. What does that look like on the ground in practice?
Well, think about dedicated Slack channels or little teams groups for specific interests, working parents, early career professionals, sustainability champions, tech enthusiasts. Or you could have location-based groups for different offices or regions. These little micro communities allow for more relevant, targeted communication and stronger peer communications. The key is that they're partially employee-led. You provide the platform and light governance, but you encourage peer-to-peer recognition, knowledge sharing, and cross-community storytelling. It's something we've preached for a long time about digital signage. We've always talked about being location-based, sending out to targeted groups. You want to use your digital signage software to support and reinforce those micro-communities. And if you can, let employees interact in that. Let them contribute content. Again, this is all about employee-led communications.
Right. I mean, that's even in the earlier days of digital signage software, that's what the different playlists going to different players let you do. But by breaking everything down and letting it be led by the employees, I think the worry would be that it would just fragment communications.
Yeah, I think that would be thinking about it the wrong way. You still have your core organization-wide channels for essential messages, like I said, but little micro communities could supplement that with spaces where people can connect around shared interests and needs. According to research, employees prefer this balance of broad updates and niche connection over everything being forced through one big channel. I would hope that those little micro communities would actually be inspired or excited by what you're putting out. So that could be a topic of conversation amongst them.
And I think by sort of monitoring, not in a creepy Big Brother way, but still, paying attention to these sort of communities that crop up, you can actually understand what's really on people's minds, because they're kind of a form of listening in some respect.
Yeah, and actually look at that as a form of feedback. We always say, pay attention to what's happening. What are people interested in? Reinforce that with your communications.
Yeah, okay. So what's the fifth trend this year?
Well, I talked a little bit about external versus internal, and the fifth trend is the collapse of that internal-external boundary. You need to realize that every internal message in today's workplace is now potentially public. Screenshots, leaks, employee social posts, regulatory investigations, cyber breaches. They've all permanently erased this boundary between internal and external.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of communicators want to hear that. That's one of the reasons why security is such a big topic these days.
Security is a big thing. It's very important, but this is the reality. Interscope's research showed that messages written for employees routinely surface outside the organization. This is why internal communications is moving closer to HR, legal teams, and even risk function teams. In 2026, unclear messaging, it's going to be treated as risk exposure.
So what does that mean practically?
Well, I think it means every message or every piece of content needs to pass what I call the screenshot test. Would this hold up if it appeared on social media tomorrow? It doesn't mean you can't be authentic or transparent, but it means you need to be consistent. It means you need to be careful. It's interesting. Edelman's Trust Barometer now shows that employees trust their employer more than governments or media, but only when leadership communication is consistent, credible, and timely.
Yeah, I think we know ambiguity creates rumors, those erode confidence, and everything gets slowed down. Clarity reduces friction and I think protects organizational momentum. So you could say internal communications is no longer just about informing employees. It's also about protecting organizational stability during uncertainty. And the times we're in are basically uncertain all the time now. And that kind of raises the stakes considerably.
It does. And it means communicators need different skills. You need to understand risk communication, legal implications, and how to craft messages that work for multiple audiences simultaneously. I know I talked about personalization and targeting, but it doesn't mean that you don't be careful in how you craft those messages. Again, think of that screenshot test. The internal-external divide isn't just blurring. In many cases, it's just gone.
More work for you.
Yeah, unfortunately. But, again, we're talking about keeping that seat at the table.
The sixth trend is purpose-driven and sustainability communication getting woven into daily operations. According to Deloitte's Human Capital Trends report, purpose-driven communication is directly linked to brand trust. But in 2026, Sustainability can't just live in CSR reports. It needs to be woven into everyday communications. The problem is, how do you do that without it feeling forced?
Well, research says that's about connecting your corporate environment and social goals to employees' day-to-day actions. You need to do that through regular updates, stories, and small milestones. This keeps your purpose visible and relevant. Don't make it some abstract thing that nobody can, really glean, or you just have a poster on the wall or one message that shows up once a week that says recycle. You need to be very intentional in those communications.
So like instead of just announcing, carbon reduction targets, maybe show how the new recycling program in the cafeteria contributes towards that goal. You here in this building, in this company, this is what you're doing, we hope, and this is what we think is the result of that. Translate ESG updates into relatable human scale stories, and then encourage leaders and teams to showcase the impact that it has locally, which I think is especially important for attracting and retaining younger workers. I know we keep talking about the younger people, but they are. The Zoomers are coming into the workforce in force, and they've made it very clear this is top of mind for them.
Yeah, and everybody focuses on those younger workers, but let's be honest, millennials, Gen X.
Yeah, it's important to me. I'm in my late 50s.
Yeah, definitely. But when talking about especially Gen Z, they want to work for organizations with purpose just beyond profit. But they can tell when it's just corporate speak. The communication needs to be authentic, specific, and connected to real action.
Purpose and sustainability can't be just something you communicate, once a year in an annual report. Like you said, woven. It needs to be threaded through regular communications. By that, I mean leadership messages, team updates, recognition programs, even in the onboarding materials and all over your digital signage.
Yeah, definitely.
So those are the 6 major trends for 2026. There are other priorities from previous years that sort of spill over and continue into 2026 as well.
Definitely. While those 6 trends represent new or significantly evolving areas, there are several priorities from recent years that remain important to these teams. Personalization, like we talked about, continues to be critical, and that sort of popped up a couple years ago. Mobile-first content is still essential, and that's especially important for reaching frontline workers or people working from home. It is the norm now.
And demonstrating measurable business impacts, I think, is always a foundational priority. Communicators need to tie their work to concrete business outcomes, reduced errors, improved regulatory compliance, higher completion rates, faster onboarding, whatever. When you can show that your communications measurably impact company performance, employee engagement and retention, you shift from being an order taker to a trusted advisor for the organization.
Yeah, exactly. Those things haven't gone away. They've just become more established. They're table stakes now. The 6 trends we discussed represent where the profession is evolving, but you still need to get the fundamentals right.
So as communicators are evolving their 2026 strategy, what are some common mistakes that they should avoid?
First, don't treat every change as a separate urgent announcement. You'll contribute to change fatigue if you do that. Instead, like we said, create a framework that helps people understand how those different changes all relate to each other. And I'd also say, again, don't assume your internal messages are staying internal, right? With that awareness that anything could become public.
And I say don't use AI just for content creation. Explore how it can be used as a strategic analytical partner.
Yes.
This is vital, especially as every few months now, there's a massive change in the way that these things are evolving and growing, and the complexity with which they can handle and parse information. By the end of the year, who the heck knows what they'll be able to do? So, keep your finger on that pulse.
Yeah, you need to build in time to understand the evolution of AI and be comfortable with it and really explore its possibilities.
Any final advice for communicators planning for 2026?
Yeah, I know we're already into it, but you have to stay on top of trends. Like we said at the beginning, they are evolving constantly. So they may shift even throughout the year. And I'd say you have to embrace your own identity shift. If old definitions of your internal communicator role limit your influence, reframe your role in business terms. It can feel kind of threatening, but it's actually an opportunity. The organizations that recognize internal communications as a strategic function are the ones where communicators will have real influence.
I'd say also invest in the skills you're going to need for this new role as you define it. And remember, you're not just competing with other communicators. You're competing with AI. Everyone can publish now. You're competing with information overload. Your value is in creating not messages, but meaning. And that's what you need to focus on. And remember what we said at the beginning. It's still, the beginning of Q2 in 2026. Things are going to evolve rapidly. So stay curious, keep learning, and be ready to adapt your strategy as new innovations emerge.
That's excellent advice. And I'll also add that every communicator should do their own industry-specific research too. What we've talked about here are broad trends, but your specific market or sector will have its own unique priorities.
That's perfect. So to wrap up, 2026 is clearly a transformative year for internal communications. The profession is evolving from tactical execution to strategic meaning making. The boundaries between internal and external are dissolving or have dissolved. Change is continuous and layered, and communicators who can adapt to this new reality will be invaluable to their organizations. This is job security through flexibility.
Nice. Nicely said.
Hey, I've been talking to Debbie DeWitt, Marketing Communications Manager for Visix, about the internal communications trends for 2026. Thanks, Debbie. As always, super interesting stuff.
Oh, you're welcome, Derek. I love talking trends.
Yes, you do. And so do I. And again, thank you everybody out there for listening. Again, I remind you there's a transcript of this conversation on the Visix website with lots of links to the research and articles that we mentioned today. For more free stuff, head to resources on Visix.com for guides, videos, and more to help with your visual communications. Please subscribe and share, and contact us for information about our digital signage solutions.